Three tow trucks rolled down the narrow street just before 9 in the morning, their engines low and deliberate, like something that had already made up its mind. The industrial block was mostly quiet at that hour. A few loading dock workers taking their first cigarette break, a delivery van idling near the corner, pigeons working the cracked pavement between the warehouses. None of them paid much attention to the trucks at first, but when the black sedan pulled in behind them, and a woman in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out carrying a manila envelope, the dock workers stopped what they were doing and watched. The woman walked straight to the front door of the smallest building on the block. A one-bay auto repair shop with a hand-painted sign so faded by years of sun that the letters were barely readable, and she knocked, twice, not politely, firmly, the way someone knocks when they already know the outcome of the conversation they are about to have. Jack Turner opened the door. He was 45 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that came from decades of real work calloused at the base of every finger, permanently stained with a faint shadow of grease no amount of soap could fully remove. He wore a gray work shirt, with his name stitched on the chest pocket. He looked at the woman, then at the tow trucks, then back at her without any change in his expression. She held out the envelope. He took it, opened it, read the first page, and folded it in half. His eyes went back to the trucks. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward in a way that could be read as threatening. He simply stood there for a moment, in the morning light, unhurried, in the particular way of a person who is not performing calm, but who has simply arrived at it through the accumulated experience of knowing what matters and what does not, and, more importantly, the difference between the two. Then he spoke. He asked the woman one question. He asked if they were certain they wanted to take the place. The woman told him he had 30 minutes. He nodded, turned back inside, and started gathering his tools. Jack Turner had not set out to own a garage. For most of his adult life, he had worked in a world where the machinery he touched was not meant to be seen by ordinary people. Armored vehicles, high-mobility transport systems, specialized drivetrains built to operate in conditions that would destroy a civilian engine in under an hour. He had spent nearly 15 years as a mechanical systems engineer for a defense contractor, working primarily on propulsion and drivetrain integration for military-grade transport vehicles. He held several patents. He had been brought in as a technical advisor on 2 separate procurement programs for the Department of Defense. His name appeared in the acknowledgments section of a government technical manual that fewer than 300 people in the country had ever read. He was, by any rigorous measure, an expert of a very specific and very rare kind, the kind of expertise that does not translate easily into a title on a business card or a number on a shop sign, the kind that simply accumulates, year by year, in the hands and the mind of someone who has spent his life paying careful attention to how things actually work and why they fail when they do. Beyond the technical credentials, there was something else about the way Jack worked that set him apart from most engineers who eventually find their way into private practice. He had an unusual relationship with failure. Most people in high-stakes engineering environments develop a fear of failure, a professional reflex that treats every system's malfunction as a threat to be contained and managed. Jack had developed something different. He had come to understand failure as the primary language through which machines communicate the limits of their design. And he had spent the better part of 2 decades learning to listen to that language fluently. He knew what a failing differential sounded like, under load at highway speed versus at idle. He knew the precise smell of an electrical fault that had been developing for months before it manifested visibly. He knew which vibration frequencies indicated a problem in the drivetrain versus the chassis versus the mounting points. And he knew the difference between the 3 without needing instruments to tell him, because instruments measure what is already happening, and Jack had trained himself to hear what was about to happen. But that life had ended. Not dramatically, not in the way stories about people who leave their careers usually unfold. His wife had died when their son was 4 years old. And somewhere in the years that followed, the idea of spending his days in conference rooms and secure facilities began to feel increasingly wrong. His son was growing up. He wanted to be present for it. He wanted a life that existed at a human scale, in a specific place. with people he could see. So he took the skills he had carried for 15 years and applied them somewhere no one expected him to, in a small industrial bay on the eastern edge of a mid-sized city, fixing the kinds of vehicles that everyone else had given up on. Long-haul rigs with transmission problems no dealership wanted to touch. Older fleet trucks with electrical faults that had stumped 2 or 3 other shops before reaching him. Specialty vehicles with proprietary systems and no available documentation. Problem cases. The work that required someone who understood not just how a system was supposed to function, but why it had been designed the way it was in the first place, and what the engineer who built it had been trying to solve. Word got around, the way it always does in the world of people who drive for a living. Among owner-operators and independent haulers, Jack's shop had a reputation that was nearly mythological in its precision. He could diagnose a problem over the phone in under 5 minutes. He charged fair rates, and he never told you something was wrong unless it actually was. He never recommended work that wasn't needed. He never held a vehicle hostage to run up a bill. He had a habit of calling customers back a week after a repair, just to check that everything was running clean, not to solicit more business, not to fish for a good review, but because he understood that the relationship between a mechanic and the person who depends on their vehicle is one that does not end when the invoice is paid. It is a relationship of ongoing accountability. And Jack took that seriously, in the specific and unshowy way he took everything seriously, which seemed like a small thing until you had been in the industry long enough to understand how rare it actually was. The shop itself was nothing remarkable to look at. The bay doors were original to the building, which dated to the early 1970s. The concrete floor had been patched so many times it looked like a map of somewhere imaginary. The waiting area was 2 plastic chairs and a coffee machine that had been manufactured before most of his customers finished high school. None of that mattered. People drove 4 hours to bring their vehicles to Jack Turner. And they did it because they trusted him in a way they did not trust almost anyone else. Not because he had asked them to, but because he had earned it. One job at a time, over 11 consecutive years, without a single complaint that anyone could substantiate. He had been leasing the property under a contract that had changed hands twice as the surrounding parcels were bought and sold over the decade. The neighborhood had shifted around him, warehouses converted to distribution centers. A cold storage facility built on the old lot to the south. A rail spur extended 2 blocks to the north to serve the new freight terminal. He had watched it all happen from inside his bay doors without much concern. The lease was solid. He had options. He had not worried about it the way he perhaps should have, and that lack of worry was the small, invisible fault line that everything else would eventually break along. Victoria Sterling had not built her company by being patient with obstacles. She was 42 years old and had been the chief executive of Sterling Meridian Logistics for 6 years, having taken over from the board-appointed interim who followed her father's retirement. Under her leadership, the company had doubled its regional fleet, acquired 2 smaller competitors, and secured a series of contracts with municipal governments that made it, by most measures, the dominant logistics operator in the region. She was not universally liked. She was too direct for that, too quick to make decisions that prioritized efficiency over comfort, but she was respected, sometimes grudgingly, by nearly everyone in the industry. She had a reputation for being the smartest person in any room she entered, and for knowing it. She also had the discipline not to let that awareness become arrogance in the obvious ways. She prepared thoroughly. She listened to data. She did not waste time, and she did not allow her teams to waste it. What she had less experience with, what she had perhaps never been forced to develop, was the capacity to recognize that some kinds of value do not show up in due diligence reports, and that the absence of something from a spreadsheet does not mean it does not exist. The expansion project had been in planning for 2 years. The new distribution hub required a footprint of approximately 14 acres, and assembling that footprint had involved buying 11 separate parcels over 18 months, a process that had required more negotiation, more legal maneuvering, and more money than anyone had originally projected. By the time the last major parcel closed, the only property Sterling Meridian did not own in the designated area was a single-bay auto repair shop on the eastern corner, sitting on approximately 1/3 of an acre, operated by a man who had politely but firmly declined every offer the company's real estate team put in front of him. The first offer had been reasonable. The second had been generous. The third had been, by any objective standard, extraordinary enough money to retire on, to buy a much better shop somewhere else, and to do essentially anything a person might want to do with the rest of his life. Jack had read each offer carefully, thanked the representatives who brought them, and said no. He had not been hostile about it. He had not been theatrical about it. He had simply said no, and the simplicity of it was, for the people delivering the offers, more genuinely confusing than any argument would have been. They were accustomed to negotiation. They were not accustomed to someone who was not negotiating. Victoria had come herself on the fourth visit. She had driven to the shop in her own car, unannounced, on a Tuesday morning, and walked in while Jack was under a truck, doing a differential seal replacement. He had rolled out when he heard her heels on the concrete, stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and waited to hear what she had to say. She told him directly. He was standing in the middle of a $200 million project. He looked at her without any particular hostility and said that she was welcome to build around him. She looked at the shop, at the patched floor, the faded sign, the ancient coffee machine in the corner, and said, with a precision she intended to land like a final point being made, that surely there was a number that made sense to both of them. He told her the number that made sense to him was the one on his lease, which he intended to honor to its end. She had left without saying goodbye, and somewhere in the car on the way back to her office, the decision had already been made, though she would not have described it that way at the time. What happened after that was described internally as a matter of corporate strategy. Her legal team was asked to conduct a thorough review of the existing lease and the chain of title on the property. It took them 3 weeks. What they found was a discrepancy in the original lease assignment, a technical irregularity in how the terms had been transferred when the property changed hands several years earlier, a flaw small enough that no one had noticed it, and no one would have thought to look for it under ordinary circumstances. It was not fraud, it was not manufactured, but it was exploitable, and Victoria's outside counsel filed the paperwork. The motion was heard, and a judge issued a lawful order for property recovery based on the defective transfer. The process had taken 8 weeks from discovery to execution. It was entirely legal. It was precisely the kind of thing that happens when a large company with excellent lawyers decides to apply its full resources to something that could more honestly be described as an inconvenience. On the morning the tow trucks arrived, a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk across the street. The dock workers had stopped working entirely. A woman from the muffler shop 2 buildings down stood in her doorway with her arms crossed. 2 long-haul drivers who had brought their rigs in the night before and slept in the cabs stood leaning against a fence, watching with the particular expression of working people watching something be done to one of their own. Jack carried his toolboxes out one by one, methodically, without hurrying, and loaded them into the bed of his pickup. He took the framed photograph from above the workbench, a picture of his son at age 6, sitting in the driver's seat of a rusted old truck and grinning like he had been handed the world. He took the coffee machine. He took the logbook where he kept his customer records, handwritten in a shorthand that only he could fully decode. One of his regular customers, a man named Dennis, who ran a small refrigerated delivery operation and had been coming to the shop for 7 years, had driven over when he heard the news. He stood at the edge of the driveway watching Jack work, trying and failing to find words that would be useful. He finally asked what Jack was going to do now. Jack put the logbook in the cab of his truck, looked at Dennis for a moment, and said he was going to wait for them to call. The woman in the charcoal suit watched all of it from near the sedan. She had done this before, overseen property recoveries, managed difficult transitions, delivered unwelcome news with the practiced neutrality of someone who understood that her role was logistical, not personal. But there was something about the way this particular man moved through the task of leaving his own shop that she found difficult to categorize. He was not performing dignity. He was not performing anything. He was simply taking care of his things with the same attention he had always given to everything that deserved it, and the crowd on the sidewalk across the street watched him with a stillness that had a different quality than the stillness of indifference. Dennis did not know what to make of that at the time. He remembered it later, with considerable precision, when the call finally came. The armored vehicle was the kind of machine that made people stop and stare. Manufactured by a specialized division of a European defense contractor, it had been developed for high-security transport applications, cash transfer, sensitive cargo, dignitary protection in medium-risk environments. The chassis was custom-built. The body was composite armor plating over a reinforced steel frame. The electronic systems, locks, communications, engine monitoring, environmental controls were all integrated through a proprietary architecture that the manufacturer had spent 4 years developing and that no other commercial vehicle on the market could replicate. The unit Sterling Meridian had acquired cost just over $2 million. There was one of it. It was the centerpiece of a contract demonstration scheduled for a consortium of municipal clients worth, over the life of the contract, something in the range of $60 million across 5 years. Victoria had signed the purchase order herself and had told her executive team that this vehicle was going to close the deal. It died in the middle of the demonstration. The location was a large commercial plaza near the center of the city, a wide, open space chosen for its visibility and proximity to the municipal building, where the contract signing was scheduled to take place immediately after. The vehicle had been staged in position the previous evening. The event began at 10 in the morning. Representatives from 6 different municipal clients were in attendance. Members of the local business press were present with cameras. Victoria stood near the front of the gathered crowd in a navy suit, watching the vehicle run through its initial demonstration sequence with the quiet confidence of someone watching a plan come together. And then, without warning, without any prior indication of any malfunction whatsoever, the engine cut out. The lights inside the cab went dark. The electronic locking system engaged fully and automatically, as it was programmed to do in the event of a complete power failure, which meant that the 2 people inside the demonstration vehicle were now sealed inside an armored compartment with no power and no way to open the doors from inside without the override system, which ran on the same power bus that had just gone down. It took 14 minutes to get them out through an emergency manual release that required 3 people and a specialized tool that had to be retrieved from a storage unit 2 miles away. The municipal clients watched all of it unfold in silence. The business press took photographs. Sterling Meridian's internal technical team was on site within an hour. They spent 3 hours with the vehicle and produced a diagnosis that was inconclusive. They knew there had been a complete electrical failure. They knew it had originated somewhere in the main power distribution architecture, and they knew that restoring the system was not something they were equipped to do. The manufacturer was contacted. Their regional technical representative flew in the following morning and spent nearly a full day with the vehicle before calling headquarters and asking for additional support. A specialist was dispatched from Europe. He spent 2 days with the vehicle, ran every diagnostic the system was capable of running, and told Victoria's team that he had never personally encountered this specific failure mode in this model, and that he would need to escalate to the engineering team responsible for the original design. The escalation took 4 additional days. During those 4 days, the vehicle sat in a secured bay at a Sterling Meridian facility, powered off, locked, completely inoperable. One of the invited municipal clients had already sent a letter through their city attorney's office asking for a revised timeline and an explanation. The business press had picked up the story in the measured but unmistakable tone of journalists who sense a larger story developing underneath the one on the surface. Victoria's board chairman had called her twice. He was not the kind of man who called people twice when things were proceeding according to plan. The cost of the failure was not only technical. Every day the vehicle sat inoperable represented a specific and calculable financial loss in delayed contract timelines, in the compounding interest of investor confidence, in the quiet erosion of the company's standing with clients who had been watching closely and were now watching more closely. One internal calculation, passed around in an email chain that Victoria read but did not respond to, placed the daily cost of the ongoing delay at something in the range of $10 million when the full liability exposure of the stalled municipal contract was factored in. The number was probably inflated as a scare tactic by whoever had run the calculation, but even a tenth of it was meaningful, and the direction of travel was clear. Every morning the vehicle did not start, was a morning in which the gap between what could be recovered and what could not grew slightly wider. People in the building were beginning to say things they would not have said 6 weeks earlier. They were saying them in the hallways rather than the conference rooms, which was a reliable indicator of how serious the situation had become. It was a senior engineer named Robert who finally said what several people had been thinking but had not said out loud. He said it in a Monday morning meeting, in a conference room with too many people in it, with the flat directness that sometimes only comes from someone who has genuinely run out of better options. He said there was one person in the state with documented hands-on experience with the base drivetrain architecture that the commercial vehicle had been derived from, not because the person had worked for the manufacturer, but because he had worked on the military-grade predecessor platform during his years in defense contracting. He said he was aware of how this was going to sound. He said the person's name was Jack Turner. The silence in the room had a particular and uncomfortable texture that everyone present would later remember. Victoria did not react visibly. She asked for the file. Robert brought it to her office that afternoon, not a personnel file, since Jack had never worked for Sterling Meridian, but a compiled background document that the company's research team had assembled in about 4 hours. Patents registered under his name, published technical papers, defense contract acknowledgments, a citation in a government report on next-generation armored vehicle drivetrain standards. Victoria read all of it in the way she read everything quickly, precisely, without skipping anything. When she finished, she sat for a moment and looked south through her office window toward the part of the city where, less than 2 weeks earlier, a man she had legally evicted from his property had quietly loaded his tools into his truck and driven away. She asked herself not whether Jack Turner could fix the vehicle. Based on everything she had just read, the answer to that question was self-evident. She asked herself whether he would. That was the question she did not know the answer to. She sent 2 representatives. Not lawyers, she had the sense to understand that this was no longer a legal situation. She sent Robert and her director of operations, Sarah, with instructions to be straightforward, to offer fair compensation, and to listen carefully to whatever he said. They found Jack at a temporary bay he had been renting from a friend, attached to a parts warehouse on the other side of the city. He was working on a transmission when they arrived. He listened to everything they said without interrupting. When they finished, he thanked them for coming and told them he was not interested. Sarah asked if there was anything that would change his answer. He said he doubted it, but they were welcome to have their employer come ask herself. They reported back to Victoria that evening. She sat with the information for a long time. Then she told her assistant to clear her morning schedule. She drove herself. No security, no assistant, no legal counsel. She had the address, and she parked in the lot in front of the parts warehouse and walked to the bay where a light was still on at 6:30 in the evening. He was finishing for the day, washing his hands at the utility sink in the corner. He did not seem surprised to see her. He dried his hands, pulled 2 old metal stools from beside the workbench, and placed one in front of her without saying anything. She sat. He sat. There was grease on the concrete between them and the smell of gear, oil, and metal in the air. And Victoria Sterling, who had sat across from senators and executives and adversarial attorneys in rooms specifically designed to communicate power, felt the particular and unfamiliar discomfort of being in a space where none of that currency was worth anything at all. She said she needed his help. He said it was the first time he had heard her use that word. She said she was aware of that. He looked at her for a moment and said nothing. She told him about the vehicle, not to explain the technical situation, which she understood he likely already knew about from the press coverage, but to be honest about what was at stake and what it meant for the company. He listened. He did not seem to take pleasure in the difficulty she was describing, but he did not rush to relieve her of it either. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he began to talk. He talked about the shop, not about what had been taken from him. He did not frame it primarily as loss, though the loss was real, but about what the place had actually been, its genuine function in the lives of the people who depended on it. owner-operators running one or two trucks, whose entire livelihoods depended on keeping those vehicles on the road, who called him at 2 in the morning when something went wrong and trusted that he would answer. When a shop in another city told them a repair would take 3 weeks and cost more than they had, they drove to him. He had been, for a significant number of people in a very specific world, the difference between keeping a business running and losing it. All of that had been treated, by the people who arrived with tow trucks and a manila envelope, as something without particular value, as an obstacle to be cleared from the path of a larger project. He said this without bitterness. He said it the way someone states a fact they have had time to examine from multiple angles and have decided is simply true. Victoria listened without defending what had happened. She did not explain it, or contextualize it, or suggest that the legal process had produced a fair result, even if it had produced a lawful one. She sat on the metal stool in the borrowed bay, and she listened, and something in the way she held herself had changed slightly by the time he finished, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible to a casual observer, but in a way that was real. She told him that what she had done had been legal. She said it had also been wrong. He looked at her and asked what she was prepared to do about it. He laid out 3 conditions. Return the property, not a comparable substitute, not a payment equivalent, not a relocation package to somewhere better, but the actual shop, the specific address, with whatever modifications had been made reversed or compensated. Issue a public acknowledgement of what had occurred, not a press release crafted by a communications team to minimize the narrative, but a genuine, direct statement from Victoria herself, on record, in her own words, acknowledging that the company had used legal means to accomplish something that was not right, and compensate the customers who had been disrupted by the closure owner-operators who had lost time and income when their most reliable mechanic was put out of business without warning. Not a large total sum, a concrete one. He told her these were his conditions for considering her request, not for agreeing to it, for considering it. Victoria was quiet for a long time after he finished. She had arrived at the bay expecting a negotiation, expecting that there would be a number, or a combination of terms, that would function the way numbers and terms had always functioned in every professional context she had operated in for 20 years. She had not expected to sit on a metal stool and be asked, in plain and unhurried language, to reckon with something that had nothing to do with numbers. She understood, sitting there, that Jack Turner was not asking her to acknowledge a business error. He was asking her to acknowledge something that went further back than business, a habitual assumption. One she had carried so long it had become invisible, that the things which do not announce their own value simply do not have any. It was the assumption she had brought into this very bay on a Tuesday morning 2 months earlier, when she had looked at a patched concrete floor and a faded sign and an old coffee machine and seen nothing worth preserving. She had been wrong, and being wrong, in this specific way, about this specific man, had cost her company 11 days and an amount of money she did not care to say out loud, and had cost a number of working people something that could not be fully quantified. She went back to her office and called a board meeting for the following morning. The opposition was immediate and vigorous. Her general counsel told her that a public admission constituted a litigation risk that the company's insurance carriers would not look favorably on. Her chief financial officer raised concerns about precedent if the company compensated people affected by one land acquisition. What was to stop similar claims from arising around future projects? 2 board members told her privately that she was making a decision based on emotion and that it was going to damage the company's leverage in future negotiations. One told her directly that the company could not be seen to capitulate to someone who had simply refused a reasonable process. Victoria heard all of it. She did not argue with any of it. When the room had finished, she said the question was not whether the company could survive not capitulating. The question was whether she could. She called a press conference for Thursday. The statement she gave was 2 minutes and 40 seconds long. It had not been rewritten by the communications team, though they had been given the opportunity and had made their objections clearly known. Victoria stood at the podium and said that Sterling Meridian had used a lawful legal mechanism to remove a small business operator from a property he had occupied for 11 years, and that while the mechanism had been lawful, it had been applied in a way that did not reflect the values the company claimed to hold. She said the shop would be returned. She said the affected customers would receive direct compensation. She said she was sorry. She said it without passive constructions, without the grammatical evasions that corporate apologies almost always use to avoid the full weight of the word. The business press covered it for several days running. Several profiles noted, with varying degrees of surprise, that a chief executive who could acknowledge a mistake directly, in plain language, without the usual machinery of spin, was unusual enough to be treated as news in its own right. Jack appeared at the secured facility the following Monday. He drove himself and signed in at the security desk and walked into the bay where the vehicle had been sitting powered off and locked for 11 days. He spent about 20 minutes moving around it, not touching it randomly, but pressing specific points on the exterior with his fingertips, standing still in certain positions and listening, in the way that people who have spent decades working with machines listen not for loud sounds, but for the particular texture of silence in different places. Then he asked for manual override tools, opened 3 access panels in a specific sequence, and requested a diagnostic reader compatible with the vehicle's pre-failure memory buffer. He sat with the data on the reader's display for about 8 minutes, scrolling through it slowly, occasionally going back to look at something a second time. The failure was a single relay, a component approximately the size of a matchbox, part of the primary power routing system, that had developed a microfracture in its internal contact housing. The fracture had likely been present for months, developing slowly under the thermal cycling of normal operation. Under ordinary service conditions, it would have generated intermittent resistance spikes that a thorough diagnostic might have flagged as early wear and flagged for replacement. But the vehicle had not been in normal service long enough to generate that kind of documented history, and the pre-delivery diagnostic had not been run under conditions stressful enough to reveal the fault. When the demonstration sequence ran at full load, all systems active simultaneously, peak thermal output sustained, the fracture propagated to the point of complete contact failure, and the entire power bus went down in a cascade that the protection systems interpreted as catastrophic, triggering the full lockdown protocol exactly as designed. The part that had failed cost $11.30. Jack had a compatible substitute in his toolbox, a military-grade component from a supplier he had maintained a relationship with since his years in defense contracting, meeting a higher specification than the original factory part. He installed it in about 40 minutes, walking the Sterling Meridian engineers through each step as he worked, explaining what to watch for and what to document going forward, in language that was clear without being condescending. He treated it the way he treated every job, as a problem, with a specific solution that deserved to be understood rather than merely fixed. He ran the system through a staged restart sequence. The vehicle powered up cleanly. Every system came online in the correct order. The locking mechanism disengaged. The engine started on the first attempt and settled into a smooth idle. He worked without theatrics. He did not look up to see if anyone was watching. He did not explain his reasoning in real time the way someone performing competence explains themselves. He simply moved through the task with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done comparable things in far less favorable conditions in military depots without proper lighting, in the field with limited tools, in situations where the vehicle in front of him needed to move, and there was no option other than making it move. The engineers around him tried to follow each step. Some of them were taking notes. Robert watched from the back of the bay with his arms folded and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have added anything to what was simply visible. The Sterling Meridian engineers watched in silence. Robert stood near the back of the bay with his arms folded, watching with the expression of someone watching a thing confirmed that they had suspected but had not been entirely certain of. Not quite admiration, something more specific than that, something closer to recognition. Several of the engineers had spent more cumulative hours staring at the inside of that vehicle than they had spent on any single problem in their entire careers. They had flown experts in from across the ocean. They had escalated to headquarters. They had done everything available to them, and the answer had required someone they had tried to remove from the equation. Jack closed the access panels, signed out at the security desk just before noon, and drove back to his temporary bay to finish the transmission job he had started the previous week. The property transfer was completed within 12 business days faster than the original acquisition had been, which was probably not an accident. The original bay was largely intact. Some equipment had been cleared out, but no construction had begun, and the work required to return it to operating condition was manageable. Jack's regular customers came back quickly, some of them faster than he expected, their loyalty made sharper rather than weaker by the interruption. Dennis brought his entire fleet in for scheduled service the first week. The doors were open again. Several of the long-haul drivers who had watched the eviction from across the street came by just to see the lights on, even when they had nothing that needed work. The sign got repainted, not fancy, not new, just legible again. The same name in the same place on the same board. Visible from the street the way it had always been. Victoria came through a period of sustained scrutiny, without deflecting any of it. The board had been wrong about the litigation risk. No suits materialized. The municipal contract was signed, delayed by several weeks but ultimately intact, partly because the rescheduled demonstration had been flawless, and partly because several of the municipal representatives had privately told their staffs that a chief executive capable of admitting a mistake directly struck them as a more reliable long-term partner than one who managed everything through a communications layer. The coverage moved on, as coverage always does. What changed for Victoria was less visible than any of that, less measurable and more durable. She began asking different questions in the early stages of new projects, not soft questions, not sentimental ones, but precise questions about what was actually being lost when something was treated as an obstacle on the basis of its size alone, and whether the company had properly weighed the full cost of removal rather than just the legal cost. She remained exactly as demanding and efficient as she had always been, but there was a different quality to the efficiency, a quality that the people who worked closest to her noticed without always being able to articulate what had changed. Some things can only be learned by sitting on a metal stool in a borrowed bay at 6:30 in the evening, with grease on the floor and gear oil in the air, and realizing that the person across from you possesses something that cannot be purchased, cannot be hired, and cannot be acquired through any process that looks like the ones you know. She went to see Jack one final time, on a Thursday afternoon in early autumn, about 3 months after everything had settled. She did not call ahead. She parked out front, walked in, and found him at the workbench, repairing an alternator with the focused patience of someone who has made a genuine peace with the particular demands of difficult work, the kind of patience that is not resignation but its opposite, the patience of someone who has chosen exactly this and finds it sufficient. He put the alternator down. He got 2 cups of coffee from the machine, the same machine he had carried out and carried back, now reinstalled in its corner, and they sat in the 2 plastic chairs. She asked him if he hated her. It was a direct question, asked the way she asked everything without hedging, looking for an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. He thought about it for a moment. Then he smiled, which was not something she had seen him do very often. He said he did not. He said he had been angry for a while, and the anger had been legitimate, but he had not found it useful to carry past the point where it stopped being information and started being weight. The thing he had cared about had been returned to him. The people who had been hurt had been made as whole as circumstances allowed. Beyond that, he did not see what hatred was supposed to accomplish. She said she thought that was a difficult way to think. He said that most worthwhile ways of thinking were. She asked whether he had known, when the tow trucks arrived that morning, that the company would eventually need him. He was quiet for a moment. He said he had not known. He had hoped, in a general sense, that knowledge has a way of making its value apparent eventually, one way or another, sooner or later. But he had not planned for any particular outcome. He had packed his tools carefully, because tools deserve to be packed carefully, and he had waited. That was all. Victoria nodded slowly. She finished her coffee. She looked around the shop at the patched floor, at the bay doors standing open to the afternoon, at the framed photograph of a boy grinning from a truck cab, at the walls lined with parts and manuals, and the organized disorder of a space that had been worked in seriously for a long time. She looked at all of it the way she had not looked at it on that first Tuesday morning when she had stood in the same room and seen only an obstacle. Jack walked her to her car. They did not shake hands. She drove away, and he went back inside, and the bay doors stayed open through the rest of the afternoon. the way they always did when the weather was good, letting in the light and the sounds of the street and the distant smell of diesel from the loading docks 2 blocks north. By 4 o'clock, there were 2 trucks in the lot, waiting for service, and a third on its way up the street. The work continued, exactly as it always had, quiet and skilled, and entirely without interest in proving anything to anyone who was not paying attention to begin with. There is a version of this story that ends with a number. The $11 relay against the $2 million machine. The $60 million contract against the third of an acre lot. Those numbers are real, and they are not without meaning. But they are not what the story is about. The story is about the fact that the only person in the state who could fix the machine was the man whose shop had been taken by the machine's owners less than 2 weeks before it failed. It is about the kind of knowledge that does not announce itself, does not perform itself, does not wait to be noticed, that simply exists in hands and in memory and in the long accumulated discipline of someone who decided a long time ago that doing things well is its own sufficient reason. It is about what happens when you stand in front of something like that and treat it as an obstacle. You are not demonstrating power. You are demonstrating your ignorance of what you are actually standing in front of. The garage stayed open, the sign stayed readable from the street, and on the days when the bay doors were wide and the afternoon light came through at a particular angle, you could see Jack Turner at his workbench, working through whatever the next problem was, with the steady and absolute confidence of someone who has always understood that the measure of a person is not the square footage of the place they occupy, but the depth of what they know how to do when it actually matters. The trucks kept coming. They always would. There is something worth saying about the nature of the knowledge that Jack Turner carried, and why it was not visible to the people who came to take his shop. In most professional environments, expertise announces itself through the systems built to recognize it: credentials, titles, institutional affiliations, the size of the organization where a person works. These systems are imperfect, but they are not arbitrary. They exist because, in most situations, they do a reasonable job of signaling where competence lives. What they cannot account for is the person who has spent 15 years at the highest level of a specialized field and then, for reasons that have nothing to do with failure, walked away from all the visible markers of that expertise and gone somewhere smaller. Jack had not left his field because he was tired of it or unable to compete in it. He had left because the life it required was not the life he wanted to be living, and the work he had taken up instead was not a step down from what he had done before. It was a translation of the same fundamental discipline into a context where the human stakes were more immediate and the feedback was direct. Every vehicle he fixed either worked or it did not. Every customer either trusted him or they did not. There was no conference room in which the results could be managed or the narrative adjusted. The accountability was simple and it was total, and he had found that he preferred it that way. Victoria would think about that for a long time afterward, about the gap between what a person knows and where that knowledge is visible, and about how often the two are in different places. She had spent her career in an environment where the gap between them was treated as a management problem, something to be closed through proper talent identification and organizational design. What she had not fully understood until she sat on a metal stool in a borrowed bay was that some of the most consequential knowledge in any industry belongs to people who have stepped deliberately outside the systems built to recognize it, and that the failure to find them is not a management failure. It is a failure of imagination. The trucks kept coming. They always would.